Welcome to this first session on the new data sharing code of practice. My name's Viv Adams. I'm Principal Policy Advisor at the ICO in Wilmslow in the Parliament and Government Affairs team, and I'm here with my colleague Paula Hamilton from our Belfast office.
Thank you, Viv, and good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here.
Paula will be assisting with questions in this session. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat box throughout the session, and we will look at these at the end of the seminar. This is a short session, which is why we are running 3 seminars, and we probably won't have time to answer all of them in the session due to time. We'll aim to pick up the most salient ones in the session. For those we don't have time to answer, after today, we'll aggregate the questions received and feed them and our responses into the Data Sharing Information Hub to ensure that the main issues are covered. So keep an eye on the Hub on our website in the coming weeks. We're keen for you to participate in our data sharing work, as I'll emphasise in this and the other 2 sessions, and we want to develop the Hub into a resource that is relevant, reactive and live. The purpose of this seminar. During this seminar, we aim to introduce the new data sharing code, explain to you how to navigate the code to find information relevant to your needs, and promote confident, proportionate and lawful data sharing. To open our session, we'll start with 2 quick questions for you, and we'll return to one of them later. To answer them, follow the instructions you've been given on joining to record your answer. Starter question 1. How much knowledge and expertise do you have about sharing data? A lot, B, a moderate amount, or C, a little? Right, we'll go on to the next one. How confident do you feel about finding your way through the data sharing code? A, very, B, moderately, C, slightly, or D, not confident yet? We will come to this one again later as well. This session provides an introduction to the data sharing code, which is still quite new. The Data Protection Act 2018, abbreviated to the DPA 2018, requires the Information Commissioner to prepare a code of practice providing practical guidance on data sharing, and those words in particular guided us in writing the new code. We published the new code on our website on the 17th of December 2020, and it will be laid before Parliament soon, and once it's been approved it will become statutory. The new code is a practical guide to data sharing. It explains relevant changes to data protection legislation, and it deals with developments since the publication of the old code, which, as you may recall, was 2011. The code has been written by us to be easy for you to use. It's a bite-sized sort of structure. You can move quickly between sections, and there are direct links to other sources of help, such as ICO guidance. It contains realistic examples and case studies, many of which were provided by organisations such as yourselves. We've also created other tools and resources to help you, and we plan to create more. Now, Paula, have you had any results from the questions we asked of delegates earlier?
Hi Viv, the results have literally just came through to me there now, so I'll read those out for you now.
Okay, thank you.
If you recall, the first starter question that Viv read out earlier was, how much knowledge and expertise do you have about data sharing? From 19% of participants, they have selected a lot of knowledge and expertise. 62% have said a moderate amount, and 19% again a little amount. So I think that's quite encouraging and room for improvement.
That's good, especially since it's new. Yes.
Exactly, yeah. And the second starter question was, how confident do you feel about finding your way through the data sharing code? The results we have are that 6% of delegates said they feel very confident, 46% say moderately confident, 20% slightly confident, and 28% not confident yet.
Okay, well, it's early days, and that's what this session is about. And yeah, well, we'll return to this question later. Thank you very much, Paula.
No problem.
So I wanted to talk about how to navigate the code. We actually do have an entire section on navigating the code, which we've also published as a freestanding item in the hub. So these circles show what I want to talk about. You don't actually have to read the code all in one go. As I said, there's a bite-sized structure to it. If you prefer to use a PDF, there will be one on the website in due course once the code has been laid before Parliament. In the meantime, you can download the whole thing by pressing the relevant button on the web page. We'll have slides coming up on all three aspects illustrated above, on the code structure, how it's laid out, the guide to navigating the code, the specific section I've just mentioned. It contains key subjects you might want to look for. For example, how do I do this? Do I need to carry out a DPIA, and in which section of the code you can find it with hyperlinks to each. I'll also have slides on the layout of contents of the sections, which are broken down to a summary, explanatory text, case studies, hyperlinks to ICO guidance and other external resources where appropriate. So first, turning to the code structure. They've got a screenshot here from the website. I hope it isn't too small for you. I suppose it depends on what device you're using, but this is a direct screenshot from our website. And as you can see, we've highlighted in a red rectangle the sections in the code. There's an initial summary just before the Information Commissioner's forward, which lists key points. And you can move between all these topics in blue as you need to. And as I said, we've got hyperlinks throughout to content in the code and to ICO website guidance, as well as to external content. Continuing on the code structure, every section has an at a glance section, which including this opening part of the code, which summarises the key points in the section, and in more detail, highlighted in the red rectangle, has the subheadings within each section, the sub paragraphs, and you can link and jump directly to them as you want to those paragraphs of content. Continuing on the code structure, another way of getting around it is to use word search. You can use, there is a word search box, as you can see on the right. And so if you wanted to look at everything to do with data sharing agreements, I just tried this by putting in the word agreements. You can see in the pink box on at the left. And this brought up 81 results within the code that you could look at, and searching on accountability brought up 71 results. So that's another method you could use. I've mentioned the guide to navigating the code. This is a specific section, as you can see at the left of the slide. Navigating the code comes after the summary, and it's also a freestanding item on the hub. And on the middle and the right, we've actually put screenshots from this guide to navigating the code. And as I said, this is key subjects you might want to look for, such as carrying out a data protection impact assessment, and in which section of the code you can find it, which is in the deciding to share data section. Again, on the guide to navigating the code, here's another example. Being clear about as to what data you are sharing, and this points you towards deciding to share data and also data sharing agreements, both of which will help you on that topic. So, in summary, a few different approaches to navigating the code. You could use the guide to navigating the code, as we've just said, pick your topic of concern or interest, and that directs you to the most relevant sections. You can also go by the headings on the web page at the left of every web page and just jump onto those links in blue, or you could use word search, which will then highlight the items that you want. Looking at sections of the code, which you could, some people, if you're looking at a PDF, you might think they look like chapters. We call them sections. Sections of the code include, broken down into two sorts of areas. We've done basics of data protection law, such as principles, security, and lawful basis, with examples and links to more detailed guidance on the subject. And we've also got sections on with a focus on particular areas, such as deciding to share data. As I mentioned earlier, that includes DPIAs, data sharing agreements, accountability, sharing law enforcement data, sharing in an urgent situation or in an emergency, sharing children's data, and dispelling myths and misconceptions. Continuing on the sections of the code, we'll focus on the accountability section. Now, accountability, as you know, it should form an important part of the culture and business of your organisation. The specific accountability requirements of the GDPR, the UK GDPR now, mean that you are responsible for your compliance with the law. You must be able to demonstrate that compliance. You should review all your accountability measures regularly. So this section sets out some basics and links you to further reading, including the ICO specific guidance on accountability, which gives you all the details you need, and other relevant websites. So the section, as with the others, starts off with at a glance, summarising what you need to know, then goes on in more detail with a link to every paragraph, so you can jump to those as you need to. And it contains 3 examples about accountability in different sectors: an airline, police, and healthcare. We have wanted to ensure that we covered both public, private, and social sectors in the code. Also contains provisions in the legislation, links to the DPA 2018 and the UK GDPR. I also wanted to say about links to legislation here at this point. Links to legislation, ICO guidance, and other external websites. We do stress in the code these are separate from the main content of the code, and that's for a practical reason, because as we're laying the code, it becomes statutory. These items, these links, if a guidance were to change, it would mean the content of the code were to change. So we expressly make them separate from the main body of the code to ensure that it always remains up to date and relevant to you. Sections of the code also include a glossary, which We had omitted actually before the consultation, but in response to your comments, we reinstated it as people found it useful. So it's a quick reference for key terms and abbreviations in the code, and it also includes links to further reading and resources. And we've got annexes A, B and C, which are a data sharing checklist, request and decision templates, and 11 more detailed, longer case studies. So this is a screenshot from the links at the end of each section, which, as I've said, are specifically not part of the main body of the code. So it ensures that they can always be kept up to date. The links will always take you to the most up-to-date link for the most up-to-date guidance. This is an extract from the accountability section. I wanted to look at examples and case studies, and we've used the lawful basis section for this purpose, which just helps to illustrate this. 3 examples in this section illustrate how different organisations and different circumstances may lead to different decisions on lawful basis. We've got utility providers relate with the lawful basis of consent, although, as you know, it's less common to use consent and maybe less appropriate with a large organisation. Government office using public task as a lawful basis, and a fintech, financial technology company, using performance of a contract. And note that the code refers you to ICO guidance for more details on lawful basis. So looking at the government office using the lawful basis of public task, a government office responsible for seeing business competition required information about the practices of a supermarket chain and its performance in the online retail sector. To understand how the supermarket chain operated, the office gathered evidence about customers' online shopping habits. The data assisted the office in understanding the range and quality of online services provided by the supermarket chain, as well as its overall value. As the review formed part of the government office's statutory function, the office was able to demonstrate that the processing was necessary in the public interest, and it relied on this as its lawful basis for obtaining the customer data from the supermarket chain. So that's just one example. In addition to examples in the main body of the code, you can find more examples and case studies across a range of sectors. As I said, we were keen to ensure that we did cover these, and we also plan to do more. There are 11 case studies in Annex C at the end of the code. You can see a screenshot on your slide, and there are 4 more in the Data Sharing Information Hub. And as I said, many of these were provided by stakeholders across a range of sectors. I also wanted to emphasise to you the Data Sharing Information Hub, which contains further resources to help you. We want the hub to grow. We want it to be useful to you as a live resource, and we want your input, especially case studies and examples, but we also want suggestions as to what you'd like to see, what will be useful to you. Please email your suggestions to datasharingcode, that's one word lowercase, datasharingcode@ico.org.uk. The hub at the moment contains items such as a toolkit for sharing data with a law enforcement authority, such as the police, a competent authority, simplified guidance for SMEs, more case studies, as I've mentioned, and more myth-busting messages. So, returning to the question we asked earlier, one of the questions, I'm interested to see how you'll answer one of them. I asked you at the beginning. Now we're nearing the end of the seminar. That's obviously we've got your questions right at the end. How confident do you now feel about finding your way through the data sharing code? Very, moderately, C, slightly, or D, not confident yet. Answer in the same way you did before, and Paula will talk through the results later. Okay. So what's next? Well, laying the code before Parliament is expected to happen soon, and then it becomes statutory. It has to lie before Parliament for 40 days. Once approved, the Commissioner can issue it, and it becomes statutory after 21 more days. As stated on the previous slide, we want to hear from you to help develop the hub and make it more useful to you. We want it to be a live resource on a continual updating basis. We're working on more content, including resources relating to sharing children's data for safeguarding purposes. And we're also working on an overarching data sharing toolkit. We're also planning further engagement with a wide range of sectors and also on topic. So a range of organisations about the code. So we're nearing the end of this part of the presentation, but before I answer the questions you've raised in the chat box, Paula, have you got the result of the last question we asked of delegates, please? Might need to remind them of what the question was.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. So the question, just to remind everyone, was how confident do you now feel after this seminar about finding your way through the data sharing code? And we've had some really good results. I'm pleased to say 43% of participants have said they now feel very confident, and that's an increase from the 6% that they answered just a few short minutes ago. 47% of participants have said that they are moderately confident, which is an increase of 1%, but I'm very pleased to see then that the vast majority of delegates feel very confident or moderately confident to navigate the code, with just 7% saying they now feel slightly more confident and just 2% not confident yet. So 9% there still feel that they could have some room for improvement. But I suppose this is just the first seminar, and perhaps this is their first introduction to the data sharing code. So data protection law is never ending, and there's always room to increase your knowledge. So if this is just the starting point, please don't be put off. We're all in the same boat in that respect. We all have capacity to increase our knowledge, but very pleasing results with the very and moderately confident both increasing.
Thank you, Paula. I'd agree. We're all increasing our knowledge all the time. We're all learning. So that's really encouraging. I'm very pleased to see that. And it's still early days. The code hasn't even been laid yet. So that's absolutely marvellous. Thank you so much for answering those questions. And thank you, Paula. So for everybody, think about what you've heard today. Read the code and use it. And this presentation, along with others, will be online later. So in summary, this has been an introduction to key elements of the code, showing how to navigate it in different ways. Producing the code has been a significant piece of work by the ICO team, and we've valued the input of stakeholders such as you. We want to continue to work with you to develop more resources for the hub, as I've said, and keep an eye on our website. Thank you. We'll now go to your questions from the chat box.
Thank you, Viv, and hi again to everyone. It's lovely to be here to participate in the session this afternoon on data sharing. And for those of you that don't know, and you can probably already guess by the accent, I'm part of the Belfast office of the ICO. Whilst we have the main office in Manchester, we also have 3 regional offices in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales for those stakeholders based in the regions. But I'm pleased to say that we've had quite an influx of questions, Viv, which I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear data sharing being the topic for this session. It's certainly generated a lot of interest in the chat. So between now and 1:45, so we've just under 20 minutes, what we're going to try and do is get through as many of your questions as we possibly can. What we have seen in terms of a bit of a trend in the questions is that we've had a lot about data sharing agreements. So if it's okay with you, Viv, I'd like to kick off with a few questions specifically about data sharing agreements, and we can try and answer those for the delegates.
Okay.
So the first question we have here is from an organisation who have asked, when using a processor, do we also need a data sharing agreement as well as the processing agreement when the processor is simply acting on the controller's instructions? Is it only when they are using the data for their purpose as another controller?
A controller processor arrangement is governed by Article 28 of the UK GDPR, which sets out the details you have to include. I mean, there's nothing to stop you using a data sharing agreement, and a data sharing agreement isn't mandatory anyway, but you should primarily control the processor relationship. You should be following the Article 28 requirements as to what you need to include. You could include elements of a data sharing agreement in there, but I think you might find that the Article 28 requirements actually cover quite a lot of the substance of what you'll need. We've got specific guidance on controllers and processors, so have a look at that first. Is that, I hope that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good, Viv. And just to let that organisation know, there's also a section within the code on what data sharing is covered by the code and what data sharing is not, which goes into that in a bit more detail and includes the links to the controller processor guidance that Viv has just mentioned. So that might be helpful to refer to that. So thank you, Viv. I hope that's that one answered. The second question we have here is about who has responsibility, Viv, for creating the data sharing agreement when the processor has a dual controller processor role. And as a second question to that, they've asked for a bit of guidance on what's the difference between an information sharing agreement and a data sharing agreement, if there is indeed any difference.
I'll do the second bit first. There is no difference. They're often called by different names, which I think we do list some examples in the code of the names by which they're known. And in fact, certain public bodies use memoranda of understanding instead. But yes, an information sharing agreement is exactly the same thing as a data sharing agreement. Turning to the other question, we've got, so you say the person is saying that there is a controller and a processor.
Yes.
And so really that I answered that previously. They should be following the Article 28, and it's the controller that has responsibility, but then they both have responsibilities, has initial responsibility, but then they both got responsibilities under that agreement, which differs from the pre-2018. Well, it's more clear than pre-2018, I'd say. You could include the provisions of a data sharing agreement if you wanted to. It's up to the controller to start it off. But in some instances, a processor might have more power and influence than actually a controller. They might have more economic power, but ultimately they do both have responsibility. But this is really outside the scope of the data sharing code.
It is, and that is helpful, and hopefully that's that one answered. And I suppose that the final data sharing specific query in terms of data sharing or agreements, Viv, is do both parties to a data sharing agreement need to rely on the same legal basis for the sharing?
I think yes, I don't think the code specifically addresses that. I don't think they do necessarily, because they've got different roles, haven't they? And they might be entirely different sorts of bodies. So certain bodies will not be able to use public tasks, for example, if they're sharing with a private body, they might not be able to, unless they're carrying out a public function. So it's possible that they might not have the same. The important thing is that it's documented.
Exactly, and that decision making of how they reach that lawful basis is there, but I suppose that there maybe isn't a requirement or a need for them to rely on the same legal basis, and it's very much a case by case one. That question.
And it's all, data sharing agreement helps you to reach your accountability obligations as well. So it will help you in the long run.
Exactly. Whilst the data sharing agreements aren't legally required to be put in place, it's certainly one way that an organisation can demonstrate their accountability under the GDPR.
Thanks, I'd agree.
Perfect. Well, I think that covers off most of the questions that we've received specifically on data sharing agreements. So I'm going to move on now to a couple of ones on slightly different topics, if that's okay. We've had a question from an organisation who would like to know if we have any advice on how to handle requests for sharing data that come from the police.
Yes, well, we have produced new guidance on this very topic, which I shall be mentioning actually in one of our later seminars. We produced more guidance on data sharing as part of the law enforcement regime, which is part 3 of the DPA 2018, as you know. Now, we have got a whole section in the data sharing code on requests to and from law enforcement bodies, or competent authorities there, as they're known in the DPA, which deals with requests both from, to, by the police. And as I said, we've produced this supporting guidance, which is linked from the hub. We have also produced for smaller bodies the toolkit that I previously mentioned, which might be useful to, say, a small organisation such as a small office or a shopkeeper, where the police ask for some, say, CCTV footage or something from a staff record in order to help them investigate a crime. And this toolkit takes you through step by step, looking at everything, including lawful basis and the principles, and gives you a downloadable report at the end to record your decision making. And we do intend to produce a more overarching toolkit in the future, which will also, be of help to a wider range of organisations.
That's great, Viv. Thank you. And we're quite fortunate to have the abundance of resources that we have on our website to help organisations with questions like this. So alongside the toolkit that Viv has mentioned, we also have an SME hub section of our website that has some really useful FAQs specifically on data sharing, and there is one that covers the question, can I share data with the police or other law enforcement authorities? That again has some useful links out to more information. So if you are a smaller sized organisation and you maybe feel a bit nervous about delving into the code in detail, that's a really good resource alongside the toolkit to check for questions such as that.
Yes, we specifically wanted to ensure that small and medium-sized organisations had access to something that was more useful to them and simplified. It doesn't stop them looking at the code and using the toolkit, but they've got the SME guidance, as you said. Thanks for mentioning that.
Yes, no problem at all. It's difficult to get a piece of guidance that fits everyone, so hopefully the website is quite useful in that regard, that it has the bite-sized pieces of guidance for the more small to medium-sized organisations, but also then the links to the full code and full FAQs if they want that further information on it.
Yep.
Great, that's that one dealt with, Viv. I'm going to move on to another question here from the delegates. We have a question here on does becoming statutory mean that the code has the force of law?
No, it means that a court can refer to it if it should come to that. I'll be talking in the next seminar about our approach to regulation, and it's actually quite remote. It's not that likely that many organisations will ever end up in that situation, but a court could refer to it. So it just strengthens its force, really. Yeah, so and until it's statutory, it's only got the status of guidance, but yes, it just gives it more force, but it does not have the status of law.
Great, that's that one covered off. Moving on to another question, Viv. We've had a bit of a specific one here from an organisation who have said that they don't have a lawful basis to share the data. They've said it is new data and for a purpose not compatible with the original purpose, and have asked, can they share?
Did they have an original lawful basis and it's changed? Is that what's happened?
That seems to be, there seems to have been some sort of purpose change with in relation to the data, and that lawful basis now no longer applies, and they're asking, can we share the data?
There is I mean, there must be a lawful basis. There will be a lawful basis. I know they might be worried and think, oh goodness me, what on earth is it? But there will be one somewhere. If they can share the data, then if they can't find a lawful basis, then that is going to be a problem. But if they could share it before, it's quite likely they'll be able to find one. They might not be able to, but they should look at our guidance. We have got a link to the guidance on the website about changing the purpose for sharing the data, and so I think they should follow that. They should look on our website, look at the code. I know that we did slightly tweak our guidance last year to make clear what the position is about that, so they will be able to find what they need to do
within the guidance. Perfect. I'm sure that will be helpful to them, and if there's anything else we can do to help in that regard, I suppose they could email in or phone the helpline, and we can try and steer them in the right direction. Because I think the whole purpose of the data sharing code is to enable data sharing, but it does still need to be lawful. There does still need to be that lawful basis in place in order to facilitate it in accordance with the UK GDPR.
Yes, and they just should check our guidance first before giving up all hope.
There most likely is an applicable legal basis that they will be able to rely on. We've had another quite interesting question, Viv, about what do you consider to be the best solution to the biggest data sharing challenge? What's the best solution?
To the biggest data sharing challenge? Goodness me, that's a broad question. What does
Isn't it? Very philosophical.
Well, the biggest data sharing challenge in the past year is very topical, which has been COVID, and there's had to be a lot of broad thinking about how to share data to help people and to protect health during the pandemic, and that has been very significant. It's occupied a lot of people. Dawn Monahan from the NHS mentioned that earlier this morning, and I will be talking about it with a colleague in the next seminar. So that's been a big challenge, and that's been working flexibly but also proportionately, bearing in mind data protection law, but we've had to work speedily, flexibly, and in a different way from we've ever done before. And I think we've probably learned quite a lot from this. I think the NHS and the ICO and all government departments have learned a lot from that. Is that the sort of thing you think they might be asking about?
I think so. I think that would be helpful to them, and I suppose it's trying to get away from the notion with this code that data sharing isn't possible. Yes, it's a challenge in some circumstances, but it's easily overcome so long as the right safeguards are put in place to enable and facilitate that data sharing safely and fairly and lawfully. So yes, hopefully that's been useful.
Yes, when it comes to protecting life, preventing harm, then as I will emphasise in the next seminar, you should share data as long as it appears to you fair and proportionate, but then try and plan ahead where you can. But if in an emergency, you should share that data, and the pandemic was one such example. But I believe that we did look at fairness, proportionality, and it was in compliance with the law. The code was written with an enabling approach because we knew that people were a bit scared about data sharing, and they don't need to be.
Exactly, and you've actually preempted one of the questions that a delegate had asked in relation to whether safeguarding trumps data protection if the end result is that, you know, potentially someone could lose their life as a result of that data sharing or not. So hopefully that's that one answered as well. We might just have time for a couple of more questions before we finish at 1:45 for the break before the next set of seminars. Viv, we've also had a question here about whether an organisation should have a dedicated data sharing policy in place within their organisation.
Dedicated data sharing policy. I think I think it would make sense to have a dedicated data sharing policy, so everybody's clear about what they need to do. It wouldn't be mandatory, but it might well form part of sound governance within your organisation, so everybody knows what they need to do. They should be relying on the advice of their DPO, so or equivalent person. Some organisations have a number of people who provide advice on data sharing specifically. So I think it would provide clarity within the organisation to do that. It might well be good practice, but it certainly isn't mandatory.
Yes, yeah, it's not an essential thing, but does sound like it could be helpful to have some sort of policy or template for that organisation to go off to, I suppose, raise awareness internally of data sharing and the implications of that, and involving the DPO and potentially carrying out a data protection impact assessment. So whilst I'm sure a policy won't cover all the data sharing scenarios that organisation might face, it might be useful to have something like that to work off in the first instance that could then be tweaked for particular data sharing scenarios. The final question, Viv, before we wrap up here, is from a delegate who unfortunately had some technical difficulties at the start, so they weren't sure if this was already covered, but just to check whether these slides are available for download after the session.
I don't think they're going to be available for free download. I understand that the sessions will be available for a time to watch again, but I'm not aware that the slides are going to be freely available. We could answer that in our hub if we could answer that as one of our questions when we put questions in the hub, though it might be a bit too late to do that. But if we remember to make a note of that, then we could find out. But I don't think they are, but the presentation itself will be available as a recording.
Yes, exactly. I think that's going to be available on the website for the next week, which organisations can all avail of. But I'm going to stop the questions there, Viv, because I don't want to run over time and for the delegates to miss their break between the next seminar and this one. But hopefully that's been very useful, and that has answered the questions. I suppose there are the other two data sharing seminars coming up. So if unfortunately we didn't have time to answer your question today, maybe they could be raised at the following two seminars. But I'll just hand back to you, Viv, to do the closing.
Okay, thank you very much for your help with that, Paula, and thank you to everybody for asking questions. Okay, so as I said earlier, keep an eye on the Data Sharing Information Hub on our website in the coming weeks for more answers to your questions, and also look there for developments. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope to see many of you at one or both seminars scheduled after this one.